So I want to welcome everybody to this session of the National Library of Israel's reading room. And this is a little bit of a different lecture than what I'm used to giving because the members of the culture team and the events department challenged me to do something out of the box. And they said, come up with 3 items from the National Libraries of Israel's collection that are connected in a kind of surprising way, each one to the other. I'm used to thinking about a topic and trying to present that topic systematically. And here we're being a little more easygoing. And it also gives me the opportunity to talk about several items from the collection that have really intriguing stories behind them. And I would say even more, maybe we'll talk about this as we keep going, it's actually beyond their research potential. Items from research library collections are often important not only as raw materials for articles and books, but also because they're testimony to stories that have happened around them. And so that's what we're planning on talking about today. And I want to start with a story that kind of comes from day-to-day life of being a curator. I didn't introduce myself, by the way. I'm Yoel Finkelman, curator of the Judaica Collection at the National Library of Israel. And begin with a kind of day in the life story regarding work of a curator. I pretty regularly get telephone calls or emails from people who I don't know saying, we're cleaning out an old apartment and we found a store of old books. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law passed away and we're cleaning out her apartment. Are these things of interest? And in almost all cases, they might be of important interest to the family. They might be of important interest to individuals, but for the most part, they're usually not things that are of great importance to the library, to our library, primarily because our collection is actually really quite good. And so, let's say a 90 or 100 or 120-year-old book is likely to be something that we already have multiple copies of. But I always, just as a matter of professionalism and also of basic kindness, if somebody approaches the library with a suggestion of a donation, it's important to check it out and see what it is. And I got an email from a woman named Stacy Darby. Her profession is that she helps families write family histories. And often grandparents or retirees will go to her and say, we want to make sure that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren know where the family came from, the stories that have motivated the family, what we stand for as a family. And she interviews people and goes through documents and helps them. And she was working with a woman named Eleanor Coe, who I do hope is here. If she's here, Daron, and she's able to say hi, that would be great. She said she might be able to make it today. Stacy might also be here. And she'd been working with Eleanor on a family history when, in passing, Eleanor mentioned the suitcase with the scrolls, something that Stacy had not heard before. And Eleanor told the following story. Eleanor said, my father, Max Brodny, had been a prominent member of the U.S. medical community, an inventor of medical tools, among other things. And he traveled in 1959 on one of the first commercial flights between the United States and the Soviet Union, together with a group of U.S. medical doctors who were going to learn about the Soviet medical system. And
excuse me, I'm sorry. Eleanor and Stacy are here and they can open their microphones if they so do wish.
Oh, great. That's fantastic. I'd love to give them an opportunity to say hi and realize that these stories are actually about real people and real events. So feel free to chime in.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, Eleanor. And also correct me if I, as usual, get some of the details wrong on this story. So Dr. Brodny is visiting Moscow And among other things, on his time off, he visits one of the synagogues in Moscow. In the 50s, there were synagogues that ran officially under Soviet influence. And the rabbi of the synagogue pulls him off to a corner, hands him a small leather suitcase, says to him, these documents have no future here. They can't remain in the Soviet Union any longer. Take them away, but be careful because you're being watched. And Max took the suitcase, brought it home with him to the United States, and there it sat until he passed away, and he and his daughter, Eleanor, who just spoke a moment ago, received them. Well, over the course of time, Eleanor made occasional attempts to reach out to scholars of Judaism to find out if they were of any significance, and for the most part, they said, no, not so important. But when Stacy got in touch with us to try to help, to try to ask what these documents are, where they came from, what their background is, I immediately became very excited because it was clear from the pictures that Eleanor had sent that that what we're talking about is a suitcase full, and you can see the image here on the left, a suitcase full of rolled up scrolls that roll from top to bottom as opposed to from side to side are called rotuli, a series of close to 100 rotuli amulets. And in addition to the document on the right-hand side of the screen, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is a manuscript, handwritten collection of magical recipes. And a lot of people, whatever their level of Jewish education, especially in the modern West, tend to think of magic as something esoteric, something weird, something odd, something really not part of the Jewish tradition, which has a reputation for being cerebral, and at least in some cases, downright rationalistic. But here we have evidence of Hebrew language amulets, magical amulets, and working with the manuscript department of the National Library, who are experts in identifying handwriting and materials, they looked at the photographs of the materials and said the handwriting is classical Hebrew characters from North Africa. The materials look like late 19th, maybe early 20th century sorts of things. So this raised a whole bunch of questions for us. The first of which, what's the nature of this collection? How did it get from North Africa to the Soviet Union? And what does that tell us about the Jewish tradition of magic? And I don't know the answer to the first question. I have various speculations about what might have happened over the course of the years. One possibility is that the Chabad, the Lubavitch movement, was active in North Africa and active in the Soviet Union underground, and it could be that that's a connection. It's also possible that late 19th, early 20th century scholars at the time referred to as Orientalists, Western scholars who were interested in the East, the exotic East. So a Russian scholar might have traveled to the exotic East, to North Africa, and made this collection on his own. Almost certainly it would have been a he. That's a possibility, or it could be any number of other things. And I frankly do not know. And this idea of documents that we show up and we don't really know where they came from or how they got where they got is part of the mystery that I want to talk about as we go through the evening and connect the different documents. I also want to look at the document on the right, which is probably older than the amulets, and which is this long notebook, tall notebook, that contains in at least 3 different hands, that is to say, at least 3 different people copied into this small notebook, magical recipes of all kinds. And so that also might be a clue. It is very possible that this collection was actually put together by a scribe, by a magician. And this was part of his guidebook. This was his guidebook, and this was maybe some of his materials or materials that he had collected or received from various people. They're not all written, not all the amulets are written in the same hand, so it's not likely that it's the handiwork of one magical practitioner. Well, what do we learn from this? What we learn from this is, at the very least, that in North Africa in the late 19th, early 20th century, magic was part of some members of the Jewish community's day-to-day lives. And in fact, lest we be tempted by just this kind of Orientalist attitude to suggest that it's, and I mean this with my tongue firmly in my cheek, I don't mean anything of the sort, but this is the kind of thing somebody might think, well, those primitive backwater communities, they were into magic, but we've moved beyond that sort of thing. Well, no, because here we can bring this amulet collection into conversation with the rest of the amulet collection at the National Library, which includes European material and Ashkenazi material, and material from all over the Jewish world, virtually all periods, including a document that we acquired a couple of years ago, a magical recipe book from New York in the early 20th century. And there's a series of scholars, some of them young in the beginning of their career, who have started to take the history of Jewish magic extremely seriously and to realize that magic and medicine, the border between magic and medicine, is very hard to define, that the border between magic and technology is very hard to define, and even perhaps that the border between magic and religion is very hard to define. And things that are magical are part and parcel of the Jewish tradition throughout so many communities, throughout so many periods. And in this particular case, well, we have these rotuli. You can see that they're rolled up, and they were rolled up because the idea was that an individual would put them in a case and wear them, carry them with the person on a regular basis. I just want to make one offhand comment before we move on, which is that virtually all the amulets are defensive magic. How do we protect a birthing mother from danger? How do we protect somebody from illness? How do we protect somebody from financial loss? And in the magical recipe book, at least some of the recipes are for aggressive magic. How can I become invisible and break into my friend's house to take back something that he stole from me? How do I create, for example, hemorrhoids among my enemies, and all kinds of other mean, nasty, ugly things that somebody could do magically. And actually, I want to go on a tangent here for a second, because I was thinking about this today when preparing for the lecture and saying, you know what, this story in which I get a random, seemingly random email message that begins a conversation and a relationship with the National Library and with Eleanor and Stacy in this case, that's continued since Eleanor's generous decision to donate this collection to the library, is I noticed that that's part of what makes my job a lot of fun. And in fact, this afternoon, I had a conversation with a fellow who had donated a manuscript of his great-grandfather to the library, a man well into his 90s who had hired an Israeli scholar since he had this manuscript of his great-grandfather to help him transcribe it and make sense out of it. And it turns out that it's a collection of biblical commentary, probably from the 1910s, 1920s, from a small circle of East European Jewish scholars who were interested in biblical criticism and to what extent it might be compatible with the Jewish tradition. And he also donated this manuscript to us. And I had a conversation with him, really just kind of offering him to talk about technicalities, about how to fill out tax forms. But in the course of the conversation, especially in these weird, bizarre times when we're looking out for connection and we're trying to figure out how to break isolation, it was really marvelous to talk to him about the memory of his great-grandfather and what this means to him, a man in his 90s. and what kind of pride he took, and these kinds of stories, in addition to the scholarly value of a manuscript like this, is really part of what makes my job so much fun. But getting back to magic, not only do we see both by looking at the magical recipe book and at the scrolls, the amulets themselves, we see both the kind of more theoretical side and the more practical side. And it also helps us trace the relationship of Jewish magic to other forms of magic. And in fact, some of the scholars who sat with us, I personally, much of the material in this booklet on the right is in Judeo-Arabic. That is to say, it's in Hebrew characters, but in the Arabic language. I do not read Judeo-Arabic myself, but we brought in a bunch of scholars to take a look at it, many of whom were very excited by this donation. And I got to kind of be a fly on the wall as they sat there and flipped through this and say, okay, this is a magical recipe. We have testimony to these kinds of magical recipes in Greek going back to the ancient world. And here it's been transformed into Judeo-Arabic 800 years later, 1,000 years later, 1,500 years later. Notice the use of this Arabic word, this Greek word, this Hebrew word in the same magical recipe. And so you also get all kinds of testimony to cross-cultural influences, to the way in which the religion and the practice of day-to-day life might not have been quite as distinctive as we sometimes think of in terms of Jewish distinctiveness. And so we kind of combine this really powerful individual story of a suitcase and its history, and Dr. Brodny, and here is a photograph of him, and the Coe family, and the way in which this kind of personal story connects up with all kinds of concerns of scholarly interest and the like. Okay. So that's kind of part one. And I think I'm going to go through the three parts of our conversation and then open it up for questions rather than open it up for questions at the moment. But when I thought about connections between seemingly disconnected items from the National Library collection, I couldn't help but think of another collection of odd and surprising scrolls, which themselves had come in a pretty suitcase. And some of the same mystery questions about scrolls, mysterious scrolls with a story that's hard to trace, well, that reminded me of this next item from the collection. And this is, on the left, we see Avram Harkavi. Avram Harkavi was a very, very important figure in the history of Jewish scholarship. He was the Hebrew expert at the Imperial Public Library in St. Petersburg in the late 19th and early 20th century. He's a key figure, if I mentioned in passing this other manuscript of East European scholars interested in integrating modern academic scholarship with Jewish studies. Harkavi is a much more significant example than the manuscript I had mentioned before. And he was a very significant figure. He was one of the first real Hebrew experts to work within the Imperial Public Library in St. Petersburg and offer a Jewish perspective on the Jewish materials that were in that library. And in his memoirs, he recalls a story. Harkavi, who lived from 1835 and died in 1919, he recalls a story that occurs in 1883 and 1884. Harkavi is well, actually, even before Harkavi in the story, let's put some context into what's going on. Libraries are professionalizing. Libraries are modernizing. The idea of a national library, of a systematic repository of materials is really gaining a head of steam, and this is roughly the same time, actually, the National Library of Israel was founded as well in 1892. And this idea of kind of systematic collection went from a transition, let's say in the Middle Ages, of an individual who would have a handful of manuscripts to the early modern period when individuals would try to collect systematically to the late modern period when collections became much more systematic and the idea of a public library, a public research library, became central. So the notion of a library and a collection are modernizing. At the same time, we're talking about a period before the founding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I mention that because at the time, our knowledge of the textual history of Jewish texts in the ancient world is much, much, much more limited than it is today. And there's a tremendous amount of speculation about what the original biblical text might have been. And part of the magic of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they give us real information about texts that circulated in at least one Jewish community in the Second Temple period. But at the time, there really weren't documents of the Second Temple period. There weren't ancient documents of that age that could really tell us something about the text, about Jewish sacred texts prior to the manuscript age of the Middle Ages. And there's a lot of speculation. And speculation leads to all kinds of shenanigans and games. There's the famous story of Moses Wilhelm Shapira, the Jewish convert to Christianity, who spent a great deal of time in Jerusalem selling real and forged antiquities, the most famous of which is his claim that he had original biblical manuscripts from before the Common Era, which it turns out he almost certainly had forged himself. And as the forgery was being discovered, he eventually committed suicide. But this is a period in which there's a great deal of speculation about the history of the biblical text. So along comes Avram Harkavi, the hero, or one of the heroes of our story. And he's in touch with all kinds of people who claim that they have information or important documents. And this is another level of connection beyond mysterious scrolls. In suitcases is this idea that somebody who works in a research library gets what seems like a random contact from somebody, and it turns into a much larger story. He tells the story that in 1883, a fellow who chose to remain anonymous in Harkavi's memoirs, he's simply referred to as Z. He won't say who the person is. So in 1883, this fellow Z is in a bar. He's drinking in someplace in southern Russia. Harkavi is convinced that this is in Georgia and Tbilisi. And a Hebrew-speaking sailor, Z tells him, is drinking along with him and tells him the story about his father. His father, he says, is from Rhodes. His father had fled from a fire in the city, and he fled with a series of ancient biblical scrolls. And Z is trying to work out what this story is from this Hebrew-speaking sailor, and eventually is able to arrange a trade, so the story goes, of these scrolls for some oil paintings. I should point out already, and Harkavi was well aware of this, that this story is preposterous. I mean, the truth is often stranger than fiction. I don't want to say that it's wrong, but there's a lot of holes in this story. Why, if this Hebrew-speaking sailors, not a common occurrence, why would he be telling this story about super valuable documents to a random person in a bar in southern Russia? Why would he then exchange them if his father had held on to these for dear life in exchange for some oil paintings? Much of this is bizarre. And so in exchange for these oil paintings, Z brings the documents to Harkavi to check them out. And I'm going to, here we have on the screen both a look at the open scrolls and a enlarged picture of detail from one of the scrolls. And if you look carefully, especially if you read Hebrew, it doesn't look like standard Hebrew script. It looks very different from standard Hebrew script. Now, that, to be honest, was true of the documents we had seen before. This doesn't look like standard Hebrew script to modern readers either, but it is. It's a North African semi-cursive script, which can be very difficult to read, but it's pretty standard, as opposed to this, which doesn't look anything at all like a standard Hebrew script. Or to be more precise, there are elements that look like a standard Hebrew script. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this looks like a cursive letter bet. This looks like a Rashi script letter Daled, and this looks like a square script Aleph. So there is some similarity between these letters, and what Harkavi is able to figure out is that this is actually an alphabet that seems to combine all kinds of other scripts, but is consistent, and it appears to contain biblical books, particularly books from the 12 minor prophets. There's also a passage from a piyut, from a liturgical poem by one Yaakov ben Yitzchak, which shows signs of being of Karaite origin and perhaps quite ancient. And Harkavi is trying to figure out if he has before him a ancient testimony to a pre-Common Era scroll of the Hebrew Bible. And if he does, he has perhaps the greatest manuscript find of the generation. This is something that could change the world if it were true, but he's not sure that it's authentic. He writes up his conclusions. Also, by the way, by the time he's able to figure out the script, he also discovers that there are minor differences between this supposedly ancient manuscript and the standard Masoretic text of the Bible. Is this some kind of an ancient Karaite document? Is this a Karaite document that has been, excuse me, is this an ancient document that's been preserved by a Karaite community over the course of centuries and has finally come into hands of others outside the community? Harkavi's not 100% sure. There, our story seems to kind of end because these things disappear and nobody quite knows where they are until we get to the great scholar, Professor Malachi Beit Aryeh, who was in the course of the 1980s the director of the National Library of Israel and is, until today, one of the great leading scholars of the history of Hebrew manuscripts. And he is interested in this story. He loves the story he read from Harkavi, but he hasn't seen the documents. And so he can't make his own judgments. And he's absolutely fascinated by the story, but all he has is the material from Harkavi. And then he discovers in Oxford the work of another similar figure, very similar to Harkavi, a figure named Adolf Neubauer, who's also part of this, 1831 to 1907, who's also part of this school of modern scholarship. And he's working in Oxford as opposed to the St. Petersburg Imperial Public Library. And he mentions that he also had seen some of these documents, and he's convinced that he has evidence that they came from the tip of the Crimean Peninsula. And so perhaps it's not from Tbilisi, but from Crimea. And so Malachi Beit Aryeh is hunting around, has more information that at some point they made it to Oxford, but at this point, we've lost track of the documents themselves. It's the 1980s, and Professor Beit Aryeh is meeting with staff of the Hebrew University. And he runs across Professor Friedrich Shlomo Perles, who is the son of Professor Baruch Asher Perles, who is one of the founders of the Bible department at the Hebrew University. And the discussion rolls from topic to topic, and Beit Aryeh mentions these documents, and the son, Professor Friedrich Shlomo Perles, says, "Oh, we have those documents at home. My father had some of those scrolls." And so Professor Perles, the son, immediately brings the documents to the National Library. Professor Beit Aryeh clips off a piece of the corner, sends it for carbon dating, in an attempt to finally put behind the question of whether or not, in fact, we have the greatest, the most important manuscript find for Hebrew literature in the second half of the 19th century. And needless to say, since this isn't a well-known story, it turns out that no, not quite. Because the carbon dating puts the document in the 17th century. This is not a 2,000-year-old or 2,500-year-old scroll. This is a 300- or 400-year-old scroll. And that's an important date, but it only leaves us with more question marks. It leaves us with more question marks because who would create this document in the 17th century? It's unlike anything we've ever seen before. Was it a 17th century forgery for some reason? Was somebody in the 17th century trying to make this document look even more ancient and obscure? Were there small groups? There certainly were groups of Karaites in the Crimean Peninsula at the time. Was there some small group who had a unique, about which we don't know anything, who had a unique script for their own scrolls, and this is all that's left of it? Any of these is possible, but what we are left with are scrolls that are not exactly forgeries, but not exactly not forgeries also. They're somewhere in between. They're not 20th century or 19th century forgeries. They're 17th century somethings, but we're left with as many question marks as we had. Perhaps we don't have testimony to the ancient 2,500-year-old text of the Minor Prophets, but perhaps we do have testimony to an obscure and otherwise unknown practice of copying texts by a group of Karaites in the 17th century in the Crimean Peninsula. Here, by the way, is an image of Professor Harkavi's guide to translating the obscure letters into modern Hebrew characters. And documents that are both forgeries and not forgeries leads us to our third document, and that is an enormous Freemason charter. The piece of paper, you can't quite see the scale on the left-hand side of your screen, but it's something that, a document that could easily cover a kitchen table, let's say, several feet by several feet long, an enormous document that is in the National Library of Israel's collection. And it's a charter of the Freemasons. And once again, if we look at the script, we will discover that it doesn't look like any characters we've seen anywhere else. And actually what we're dealing with, much like if we're talking about mysterious semi-forged documents in odd handwriting, in odd script, we discovered that this is a wonderful example. And it's a reflection of the bizarre circumstances that Freemasonry found itself in as it developed over the course of the modern period. because it turns out that this charter of the Freemasons is exactly that, both a forgery and not a forgery at the same time. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, let's start with some background on Freemasons and begin actually with an awareness that good, accurate information about Freemasons is pretty hard to come by because they were a secret society, that was often persecuted by governments, because there are all kinds of rumors and conspiracy theories about them. And if you're interested in Freemasons and you put Freemasonry into Google or YouTube, you're much more likely to find bizarre conspiracy theories and nonsense by the kinds of people who wear tinfoil hats than you are to find reliable historical information. And so getting reliable historical information about Freemasons is pretty difficult. But broadly speaking, we're talking about the gradual transition of a medieval guild to a modern semi-autonomous society. Masons, of course, are stoneworkers, and Freemasons were given that name in the Middle Ages by virtue of the fact that they were considered experts. A real expert stoneworker, a Mason, was very hard to come by. Architecture was not what it is today. And so a real expert who could plan and execute the building of large buildings was hard to come by, and is likely the kind of person who would spend a long period of time in one city until a project was done, and then it was time to move on. And Masons were free in the sense that they were allowed to travel freely. They didn't need travel documents in the way that others people were. Simply by being an expert Mason was enough to entitle you to move from city to city freely. And gradually over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, this medieval guild of stoneworkers turned itself, beginning in what's today the United Kingdom, England, but gradually spreading its way through Europe and the United States, into a kind of secret society. And it's important to understand the place of this kind of society, and also in the transition to modernity, because the situation of a guild and the status of a Freemason in the Middle Ages is very different than what happens as modern nation states are beginning to develop, and as governments are becoming more centralized and governments are becoming more absolutist. And as this happens, the idea of an organization with membership, with rituals, with strict adherence to rules and to governance and to protocol began to look too much like the developing practices of governments. And so governments looked to askance at these organizations, even if in practice some of this secrecy was fun and games, and even if much of what was done was good works and civil society, governments were concerned that this institution could easily become a competitor to governments itself. Similarly, religion looked askance at Freemasonry. Both Catholics and Protestants looked askance at Freemasonry because they said, here we have an organization that meets on a regular basis, that performs rituals, and doesn't care about people's religious affiliations. Perhaps this is the kind of thing that's going to invade the territory of religion itself. So even though Freemasonry was becoming increasingly popular, it was also needed to keep secret because of the way in which it was treated both by developing governments and by religious organizations. As an aside, Freemasonry is actually phenomenologically very significant for understanding Jewish history because, as the great Jewish historian Jacob Katz points out, it's one of the first organizations that's willing to welcome, European organizations, that's willing to welcome Jews as equal members and as individuals. And it becomes a kind of trial ground for what becomes emancipation and the treatment of individual Jews as citizens of nation states, something that develops in the late 18th and into the 19th century. So there were Jews, and Jews as members of Freemasons. There were often one of the few places in European culture where rich and poor could meet equally. But in any case, the Freemasons were deeply concerned into the modern period, 17th and 18th century, about their legitimacy. What better way to defend your legitimacy than age and consensus? And so the Freemasons were very proud of what they called the Cologne Charter. And that's the document we're looking at, is a copy of the Cologne Charter. The Cologne Charter of 1535 that basically declares, we can read some of the English translation here, the fraternity of the Order of the Freemasons, which is bound together by the sacred vows of St. John, do not trace their origin from the Order of Knights Templars, nor from any other spiritual or secular order of knighthood, neither from a single one nor from several united together. It is not the remotest association with any such, either directly or indirectly, but it is more ancient than any orders of the kind, for it existed in Palestine and Greece, as well as in one portion or other of the Roman Empire, even before the Crusades, and before the time when the knights just mentioned went to Palestine. This has been proved to us from different documents and notoriously well authenticated ancient records. So here, the Charter of Cologne basically says, we're not some organization that's linked to this or that religious group. We're not some up-and-coming Catholic organization. We're not some linked to any particular nationality or linked to any particular religion. We are as ancient as it gets, and we are above the fray of all your petty concerns. And if we can demonstrate that this goes back to the 16th century, to 1535, that this was the consensus, say 18th century Freemasons, notice that this is already a 200-year-old document. It's part of our tradition that that Freemasonry goes back to the ancient world, and we're not therefore a threat to this or that group. We're willing to live alongside. We get along well with everybody. And part of the way of making this seem ancient is to write in cipher, and that gets back to these odd characters. The Charter of Cologne is written in Latin, but in a secret script. This both fits in with the notion of this mysterious secrecy as part of Freemason culture, as well as demonstrating its ancientness and significance. That's part of the Latin as well. And if it has signatures at the bottom from major 16th century figures across the ideological and religious spectrum, well, how much more so is this an important historical document? The only problem is that, of course, it's not a 16th century document at all. It's an 18th century document. It's a document that is written by French Freemasons in the 18th century, pretending to be a 16th century document in order to demonstrate the ancientness and legitimacy of Freemasonry itself. And so the practice of Freemason groups around the world is to keep a secret document in cipher, a copy of the Cologne Charter with them, despite the fact that this document we're looking at from 1940 is, this document that we're looking at from 1940 is authentic in the sense that it is a copy of an older document. But it is also a forgery in the sense that it was written in the 18th century as a way of pretending that 18th century Freemasonry is much older than it actually is. And of course, it's easy to see the connections between this idea of a semi-forged document in odd characters that is secret and testimony to the behavior of a somewhat odd and not very well-known group. That is 3 items from the National Library of Israel's collection, and some perhaps behind-the-scenes connections between them. And I think now would be a great time to open things up for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Finkelman. Sandy writes, can you possibly describe or translate what a few of the inscriptions meant? The boxed off items with the small circles, for example, who translated them, and are there books on the subject?
Which document are we talking about?
I believe it's the first scrolls.
The first scrolls. We're talking about this material. So, like I said, I do not read Judeo-Arabic. So I'm not going to try to read and translate this here, but I will point to these very bizarre letters, which are traditionally Hebrew characters that can be read only by angels. And so it is a language, or it is a set of Hebrew characters that is known, which magical practitioners go about learning, so that they can write texts that can be read by the angels, because much of Jewish magic is designed to be a kind of incantation or an oath that is sworn to angels to behave according to the way that the magical practitioner commands them, and that's the reason for these particular odd kind of letters.
Thank you very much. Sandra asked, what material are they written on? What time frame did you say they originated?
Okay, if we're talking also about the amulets, so most of them are on paper. Some of them are on parchment. There are a few really beautiful ones, carefully written on parchment, that are what are called spherotic trees. They are symbolic descriptions of the spherotic upper worlds of the Kabbalah and of Jewish mysticism, and demonstrate how the divine power can be brought down into this material world by way of these spherot, these mystical forces, cosmic forces, and those are on parchment and were probably more valuable and more professionally done, but most of them are on paper. The period is, at least for the scrolls, the amulets themselves, late 18th, early 19th century, and some of the material in the notebook might even go back to the 17th or 18th century.
Thank you very much. There are two questions that are kind of related. I believe you mentioned some of the things that they're asking about, but Julian asked, what were the amulets used for? And then Chihiro, I hope I'm not destroying the name, would love to know what are some of the steps that are described to making that magic happen.
Okay. Like I said, most of the amulets are 19th century, are defensive. They're mostly concerned with protection, and that's pretty standard in worn amulets. And these, again, were rolled up and put in some kind of a case and worn either around the neck or kept in a pocket or some such to defend the individual. I would say roughly three kinds of magic that are given testimony in these documents. One is, as I mentioned, incantations and oaths that are administered to heavenly forces, particularly angels, commanding them to protect the individual. So that's one version, and it's pretty common in the amulets. Another version, like I mentioned, is what's called practical Kabbalah, and an amulet of a spherotic tree, as I mentioned, is the kind of thing that would use more Kabbalistic language, that is the language of the upper worlds and the spheres, and their influence on the lower worlds. That is much less common, but it exists here as well in the spherotic trees. And much of the notebook is filled with what's called sympathetic magic. Sympathetic magic is more like the popular culture version of voodoo dolls, where the sympathy is some kind of connection between an object and the object that you want to do magic on. So in the kind of popular culture version of voodoo dolls, and I say nothing at all, of course, about Caribbean magical tradition, about which I know nothing, but the popular version is you kind of have a doll representation of your enemy, and then you poke the doll, and then it affects the enemy. So much of the notebook is full of sympathetic magic. That is to say, if woman is having trouble giving birth, then you will do some kind of a magical act with let's say the afterbirth of a cat and mix it with virgin wax or the like, or ashes, and then becomes this kind of symbolic connection between the woman having trouble giving birth and the birth material of an animal. And those are kind of, in broad terms, three categories of magical practice that appear in these documents.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Yoel Finkelman. A very special thanks from me and Gmar Chatima Tova to everybody, Shana Tova. I will open the microphone so you can thank Dr. Finkelman personally. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoel. Gmar Chatima Tova. Tia Bari.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful, Yoel.
Hi, Bill. Take care, Bill. Be well. Good to see you.
תודה רבה, מעניין מאוד.
תודה.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Many, many thanks. It was great. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much from Canada.
Thank you very much from Philadelphia.
Thank you very much from Yerushalayim. Shana Tova.
And I'm listening from New York.
And Eleanor in Chicago, but now in Michigan, thank you. It was a wonderful talk and so enlightening, and I so appreciate it. I'm thrilled.
Absolutely my pleasure.
Thank you very much from Pittsburgh.
Laila Tov, Shana Tova. See you in our next events.